Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event. My name is Bree, and I am the Assistant Events Director at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Mass. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. And if this is your first time hearing about us, welcome. We're very happy to have you all join our community this evening, and we appreciate your support of the authors and independent bookstore through purchase and attendance. As I said earlier, the chat and question box are open down at the bottom of Zoom, so feel free to make use of those. If you're going to use the chat, just make sure to set it to all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see you. The authors are going to be pretty busy, so they probably won't get to answer your chat. Please note that Brookline Booksmith has a strict policy against abusive behavior and language, and at our discretion, any attendee can be removed from an event for partaking in such behavior. First, Helen Fremont is the author of The Escape Artist, the national bestseller After Long Silence. Her works of fiction and nonfiction have appeared in numerous journals and anthologies, including Prize Stories, the O. Henry Awards, Plowshares, and the Harvard Review. Helen, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Our other two authors are Liza Rodman, who attended UMass Amherst and received her Bachelor of Arts with a concentration in creative writing from Vermont College. She has balanced her life as a mother, stepmother, writer, and tax accountant for more than 35 years. In 2005, she began researching the story of Tony Costa and realized her personal connection to the infamous Cape Cod killer. She has gathered thousands of documents, testimonies, and interviews, perhaps more than any other investigator or journalist who's worked on this case. Jennifer Jordan is an award-winning author, filmmaker, and screenwriter with decades of experience as a news anchor and investigative journalist. She has worked for NPR and PBS, and her work has also appeared in a variety of national and international newspapers and magazines. She has directed and produced several documentaries, including 3,000 Cups of Tea, which revealed the flawed 60 Minutes report on renowned philanthropist Greg Mortensen. It appeared to her, in addition to her own Savage Summit and Last Man on the Mountain, she has ghostwritten two others. The Babysitter is her fifth book. The Babysitter, which we're of course here to celebrate tonight, reveals the chilling and unforgettable true story of a charming but brutal serial killer on idyllic Cape Cod and the lonely little girl who unknowingly befriended him. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
We lost.
Hello.
Jen.
I think I just froze my screen, but thank you, Bree, for that lovely introduction, and thank you, Brookline Booksmith, which is, for those of you who don't know, probably the best bookstore in the galaxy. I think that's safe to say. And thank you all for attending. This is just such a phenomenal book. I was so delighted to be able to read it. Now I've read it a couple times, it just gets better. It's so rich, there's so much to talk about. And it's really interesting that it is a sort of a hybrid. It's a both incredibly moving and beautifully written personal memoir about a very painful girlhood. And it's also a true crime, sort of gripping and grisly story of a very charismatic.
We lost her.
Helen, you're frozen.
Felt in many ways even safer and more comfortable with Tony Costa than with her own mother. So to begin with, though, I am intrigued that this is written by two authors collaborating, and it's seamless. It is just such an amazing work. And I thought I would begin by saying, or asking, could you tell us a little bit about the history of your friendship, your relationship?
It is decades old. We met when I was brewing a pot of coffee in my dorm room at UMass Amherst. And all of a sudden I heard the door open and a cup preceded Liza into the room and asking for a cup of my French roast. And that was really the beginning. And we hitchhiked to Vermont together to visit my family. We hitchhiked back to Boston to visit her family. We spent a summer together working as chambermaids in Oregon. And here we are, 40 plus years later, working on this story. So it was a decades long collaboration in the making.
That's a wonderful story. It started with a cup of coffee, and I can imagine it going in any number of different directions.
I think actually I was begging for the coffee at that point.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Liza. You were the one who really began this project, and can you take us back to what it was that prompted you to research this material and then decide to write a book about it?
Right. So I was finishing my bachelor's degree, and late in life, I was in my early 40s, and I started having this series of dreams. And I've always been a weird dreamer, and you'll see that in the first chapter. My mother makes a comment about that. I've always remembered them. They've always been kind of crazy. So I started having these dreams, and one after the other were violent, and there were weapons and there were similar images. So I did what I do, which is I started writing them down. So I could compare them and see what was happening, where I was going, why was this happening to me? And then I had not the final dream, but certainly one of the final dreams. I was stunned. Oh, and that's the other thing. The faces in the dreams were blank. And I kept saying, well, why would the faces be blank? And some of the faces were not, but the perpetrator, the faces were blank. So then I recognized him in one of the last dreams, where he was holding a gun to my head in the hotel where some of us grew up. So then I asked my mother. I asked both my mother and my aunt one day at dinner. I said, I'm having these really crazy dreams. And the last one I had was about Tony Costa. What do you remember about him? And that's when she delivered her famous line of, well, he didn't kill you, did he? I remember he became a serial killer, but he didn't kill you, did he? So that's basically it in a nutshell.
And at what point, I mean, it sounds like you had always been a writer. When did you first identify as yourself as I'm going to write, or this is something that's part of who I am?
I'm not sure I even actually have. I always wanted to. I wrote my first story when I was 10, due to a good teacher who said, you can do this. And but then, and I always journaled, and I always wrote, and I always wrote stories, and I always wrote terrible poems. And, I went through that stage of my life like a lot of us do. I don't think it was until 2000 when my kids were starting to really grow up and move away. And I said, you know what, I'm going to do this. And I met two women here in Newton, and we started a writers group. And it was at that point that they encouraged me, and that I really started to look at myself that way. That it might be possible.
How about you, Jennifer? Did you always consider yourself a writer? Did you hope that you would?
Well, I always wanted to be a journalist, and I'm going to date myself in saying that I wanted to be Barbara Walters. I wanted to be Barbara Walters.
It's good to shoot low, you start low, yeah.
Oh, no, I'm not a low shooter. So I went to college, got my double major in journalism and Middle East history, and just always worked in journalism. And then it was interesting. I was working at WGBH, and I was working on a story for WGBH television. I was working both radio and television at the time. And the host of the show took the segment I was producing. And I was outraged because I was going to be the host of the segment. And my producer said, oh, relax. You have all the sources. Write an article about it. And that was my first published piece in the Improper Bostonian, if any of you remember that once fabulous magazine. My first cover, and that really gave me like oh my God, I love this. I mean, I always loved journalistic writing, but the real concentration of a profile piece, of the interviews and the research and the background, just lit my candles, and that was it.
Did you ever imagine that you would be collaborating or working together on a book?
I never did, because
No,
I
didn't
didn't
either.
know her struggle with, or her urge to be a writer. I didn't know about that till years later. And then when she told me one night, I'm working, I realized this crazy thing about my childhood. And I looked at her and I said, well, you keep telling me you want to write. There's your book. And when you write it, it's going to be called The Babysitter, because it's an incredible story. And so that was kind of the beginning of our collaboration on this.
And I kept trying to write around it.
That's
I kept trying not to write it, and it kept coming at me.
Well, good
I
stories
saw-
do. They do
yeah,
that.
yeah.
They do.
And that was in 2005, Liza, that you started actually writing, or even before then?
After I had asked my mother and my aunt, I had been writing. I'd been writing a lot, trying to work on different things. But it was in 2005, once they told me, oh, so-and-so became a doctor and so-and-so became a lawyer, and oh, Tony Costa became a serial killer. Then I said, all of a sudden, it was as if it was that moment in time where you go, this might actually make sense. And that's a problem. So I have to find out now who this guy was, who I think he is, and who they know he is. And that's what sent me to the research. And I didn't have a book in mind. I had more of a personal excavation in mind.
Right.
Did you have any support in that project?
No.
Did you?
I have my writers group.
Okay.
And they really encouraged me to keep going. And had I not had that, I wouldn't have done it.
Wow.
So, yeah.
So at what point did, Jennifer, did you actually, or were you enlisted by Liza, or how did you two get together to actually think we could do this together?
Well, I am always kind of running through story ideas and book ideas. And I run them by my agent. She's like, oh, sweetheart, I know. You're thinking about this. You're not going to sell more books than, your mother and your aunt and your. So, and the element of a great story that she keeps, hammering at me is that you have a fabulous core element, and around it, you have a historical reference. And when Liza told me the story of The Babysitter, I thought, oh my God, there's such an incredible book there. You have a young, innocent girl having a crush on her handsome babysitter, and he's a serial killer. But the larger story is this incredible setting of P-Town and the 60s, and drugs and sex and alcohol and the gay scene. And so you have an incredible collaboration of a core story within a context that makes it so much bigger than it already is.
Yeah.
And so I urged her to to really get to it, and then kept asking, how's the babysitter coming? How's the babysitter coming? And then finally, I was at a stage in my professional life, kind of between books, and I went to her and I said, would you like my help? Can I help you get this story out of you? And she cried, and here we are.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, it's amazing to me that it's such, the tone is so consistent throughout, and the pacing is just perfect. There's never a point, and I would think with two writers, I mean, even with one writer, it's really hard to get that sort of shape and proportion. Never mind the voice, which is so, I mean, it's a terrific voice because it's both incredibly personal, there's humor in it, and there's also, it doesn't make little of the real violence and cruelty and outrage that's going on. Was that difficult for you to work out between you, of how to figure out which proportion to emphasize, or how do you make it so smooth? Or did it just come naturally? If that's the case,
We can stop here.
Yeah, we could stop there. Yeah.
Well, I mean, for me, why I love nonfiction rather than fiction. I mean, I love to read fiction, but I'm not a fiction writer. And I think the reason I'm a nonfiction writer is there are rules in nonfiction. You have a story, you have facts, you have a timeline. And so my job is to take those facts and that timeline and make it sing and make it, just as you say, a wonderful kind of beautiful symphony of words. And I, in working with Liza, I had so much of what she'd already written and so much research that she'd done that, for my part and my part of the writing, it was just working with this huge amount of information and making it a song.
Wow. That's
And
impressive.
I think, my favorite little cartoon of the writing and creative process is on the top, there's the long highway with the mountains in the distance. And it looks like a lovely ride. And down below, there's a car wreck. And so that's the creative process. Well, that's what it looks like, and that's what it feels like. We went through that too. We slogged through it. And sometimes we went word by word. Sometimes we went week by week. We really, I think we experimented with how best to get the collaboration to work. And, sometimes we were successful, sometimes we weren't. And I think that's important to say that because other people who are out there doing it, it's just not easy. It's just not. And, we came to the table with so much, the two of us, and tried to meld those styles together. And we have a book. So it's an amazing thing in a way. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the investigation. This is so perfectly researched and thoroughly researched, and it's really impressive, not just the quantity, but the quality of the information that you were able to get from people who were really had already been traumatized, had been victimized by Tony in many ways. And I'm just curious, how did you manage to sit down and get those kinds of conversations going?
You want me to start, Jen?
Yeah, because you did such lion's share of the research for 15 years before I even came on. So
I first of all had so much written information. I had trial. I found when I started by trying to get the trial transcript from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and they couldn't find it. So I went to another direction, and I found it somewhere else. I found it. So I had 10,000 pages of interviews, taped interviews by investigators. I had the police notebooks.
Wow.
I had the contents of the car. As you'll see when you're reading, that VW plays a big part. One of the victim's cars plays a big part. So I had the dentine gum that had been in that glove compartment, and it still smelled like cinnamon.
Oh
and
my gosh.
The markers still worked. And I had Tony's sunglasses, and I had Tony's bracelets. And so I had stuff that was coming at me. I think that's part of the reason it took me so long was
and you had Tony's voice.
I had Tony's voice. I had a lot of things I recognized.
Yeah.
And then I started seeing myself in some of those stories that investigators were talking about. So it went on, the research went on for a long time, but we had so much. I had so much. It was such a lucky thing. And then, and I know Jen wants to talk about this interviewing process too, because we had a lot of interviews and we had a lot of wonderful people. But again, when the creative process is going, we also had people who told us untruths. People, and we would find out later, people who threatened us in writing, because this is a traumatic story.
Yeah.
And people were traumatized 50 years ago, and you know what? They still are.
Right.
And so we had to be both sensitive to that but we wanted to get our story told too. And, so that was a real, it was another one of those struggles, like the creative process is, to try and weed through what people were saying and figure out what was true and what wasn't. Because memory's a funny thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, we kind of ran into the Provincetown circle the wagons
Yeah.
wall.
Yeah, we
And
did.
we heard from, within that circle that people had been told not to talk to us.
Mhm.
And that, it was very much, it became an us in P-Town versus them, those, nasty
Wow.
writers dredging up this sad and painful history.
Hmm.
And so we had to fight through that a lot. And as you mentioned, Helen, there were some just miraculously brave people that came forward.
Mhm.
One of whom was one of Tony's followers, a young kid at the time, and teenager at the time,
Yeah.
who confessed to us and claimed to us that he'd been raped by the parish priest.
Yeah.
And wondered if Tony had. And so we had all of this, like, whoa, where is this going?
Right.
In looking into that community and
So
how,
stories we ended up not being able to tell in this book
right,
came from all that research.
right.
Yeah.
And a lot of people that we interviewed that said, don't use my name, I'll talk to you, but I don't want it to be known that I talked to you. So
Yeah.
we faced a lot of stonewalling.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's also, I wanted to talk about the characters here are so richly developed and so humane. I mean, even, Tony really was quite a charismatic and interesting and complicated and fascinating character, but there are so many of them here. I mean, and even like Liza, your mother, you actually, despite the things that you suffered at her hands, I mean, she was actually, physically abusive. And nevertheless, and I think this is also so telling of what women were what it was like to be
Right.
a woman, a single woman at the time, and how they were treated, how they were seen. But it's a real gift for a writer to be able to take those experiences that are extremely painful and survive, and then be able to see the humanity. And because I think that your mother comes across as a real sympathetic person. There isn't anybody in this book that I don't care about or don't like. And that's, I mean, either that shows what a sick person I am, because I'm really attracted to these serial killers, but I think you do a phenomenal job. And is that something that the two of you work together on? Is it something that you had to struggle to overcome the impulse to just go, I have a pen, I'm going to, exert power over these people?
For me, and I'm sure it's different for Jen, but for me, it was a priority not to paint my mother in one light, because she was so many more things.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right, and also to put her in context. Now that doesn't change what happened,
Right.
and it doesn't change how I felt about what happened, but it does let you see, I think, from a historical perspective, what it was like. She was single.
Mm-hmm.
She was divorced, and she was Catholic, and she was pissed. I would have been too. So, aside from who she was long term, and that's a different story, Jen and I talked extensively about how to make that happen, how to make her put her work ethic in, how to put her sense of humor. She was this funny, adoring sort of free spirit in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so we really worked hard to bring out the dualities of the personalities involved.
And it's interesting, as I think about your question, Helen, I realize that it was harder to make Betty sympathetic than it was Tony. Because Tony was, in Liza's life, a gentle, warm, generous, handsome, charismatic man.
Yeah.
And Betty was, I kept asking Liza, give me a soft moment. You had to have had a moment, and that's what there's a scene in the book where Betty is reading "Wind in the Willows" to Louisa and Liza, and it's like, thank you, Liza. I just, give me a story that will help soften her edges, because a two-dimensional character is not an interesting one.
And with Tony, we struggled to make sure we weren't too sympathetic.
Right.
So, I mean, every character is different, and
right.
And it requires a different process, I think, especially when there's two of us doing it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Well, once we're on the subject of mothers, I think it's really interesting and ironic that, Liza, your mother was in many ways, I mean, as she, I was so amazed that you were able to finally, as an adult, say, what was it? What did you have against me? And that her resentment and her anger, that you had the audacity to, be conceived, at a time that it was inconvenient. You call it inconvenient conception. B, that you were a girl, and C, that you had an independent will of your own. So your mother just had so much rage and blamed you for things that you were innocent of. We could get into the whole sibling thing too, but we'll step aside for. And whereas Tony, and at least not in this book, you're not yet a serial killer. Tony, the serial.
Not yet.
Oh, she's frozen again.
Unconditional, I mean, the things that she witnessed actually of her own son, that raises other issues too. But I mean, and she was a very, very loving person to you too. She was warm physically and embracing. So, mothers, and of course you are also a mother. And I don't know whether the two of you have talked about what it is, as
well, I think mothers get the bad rap, Helen. I think any time a kid goes out and burns down a barn, it's the mother's fault, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, and we have this conversation from time to time in my house about angry mothers. So, but I think that the bigger issue there is the nature versus nurture issue. And the fact that under those circumstances, see, we don't know what happened to Tony. We don't know. We suspect something did. We don't know. Actually, we do know some things, but at the hand of his mother, we don't have a good window on that. All we have is this overly protective, overly adoring, I'm going to ignore what I'm seeing, mother.
Right. Tony can do no wrong.
Right. My Tony could do no wrong. But in the end, I think it's not just that makes a serial killer out of a person.
Right.
There has to be an abnormality in the brain, and there has to be other things that are going on. And then you get something like what happened to Tony, and all hell breaks loose. And it's part of the conversation I hope gets elevated at some point about whether or not we can prevent this behavior. And what we do about mental illness. I mean, we watch Tony in that book, at least I hope we do. We watch him struggle with what's going on in his brain. Yes. We watch that.
Yeah.
And we also watch him commit atrocious crimes. And so, for me, I think it goes so far beyond the mother. And I think oftentimes we go there first, don't we?
Yep.
The mothers, even your question.
Sure.
And I think he was physically disabled in his brain. Jen, you want to?
Yeah, what's interesting to me, and Helen, your question really brings it to the forefront, is that Liza had the violent, abusive, emotionally and physically abusive mother. She was neglected. And Tony had the loving, nurturing, at least on the face of it, adoring mother. And yet Tony became the serial killer.
Right.
Liza became the writer and the loving mother and loving wife and loving friend. And it's interesting that, it, again, goes back to Liza's comment about nature versus nurture. Like, for whatever reason, Liza had all of the, all the stuff to become the serial killer.
I did.
Whereas
I also had therapy.
Yeah.
I advocate.
Mhm.
Tony could have done with your therapist, I think.
Yeah.
And so it's just an interesting irony, if that's the right word, and back to your question, Helen, about mothers. I mean, maybe it's not the mother's fault. Maybe
Yeah.
it's got to do with a lot more of, genetic and whatever.
I think the book's full of ironies too. I think that's not the only one. There are a lot of them, and that was purposeful to try and make that happen. So I'm glad to see that.
You were more scared of your mother than you were of a serial killer.
Right, exactly.
Is your mother, she's still alive? She's in
She's
her...
not. She just passed away.
Oh.
She passed away
I'm
in
so
December.
sorry.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah,
Oh.
she was 85. She was.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know that. Yeah.
Oh, that's all right. Don't worry about it, Helen. She, I don't think she wanted to be around for this book, quite frankly.
Yeah.
And she had some things that sort of got away from her. She was shut in. So both she and my aunt, who's also in the book, passed away within months of one another, right before the book came out.
Because I was going to ask, what was their reaction to your writing, your work, and also your sister?
Well, my mother has one reaction to everything like that. And when I first told her I was going to write the book, she said, as long as you make us look thin and rich, we're good. We're good to go. If you do anything else, you're out. But I was out anyway, so what did I have to lose, right?
And she really did cooperate in her weird way with you. It gave us great one-liners, and I mean, Betty to the end was famous for her one-liners. And we crammed it. In fact, Liza keeps telling me more. I'm like, stop! The book's published. I can't. I don't want to hear any more wonderful bon mots, and I can't put it in the book.
Yeah. She did a lot of her stories are in that book.
Right.
So
that she shared with Liza since the writing started. So that really,
that's interesting.
She,
in her kind of backdoor way, was very cooperative.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the acknowledgments, I recognized both my sister and my mother, because without my mother, we wouldn't be sitting here now, would we?
Yeah. Yeah.
So speaking of irony.
Yeah. I think that was it, my assumption, because I read, that it was addressed directly to your mother in the acknowledgments. So I assumed she was, and I'm sure she is somewhere there to read that.
Yeah.
Because when we wrote our separate acknowledgments, she was still alive. I mean, she
Yeah.
died recently.
Yeah.
I'm glad for you, Liza, that it is in the present tense, because it gives her.
That's a good point. Yeah.
It gives her an eternal presence.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Thought of that.
Yeah.
She'll be glad. I've got a candle burning for her in the back room right now. So
that's nice. Why don't we jump ahead and talk about the criminal justice system, a subject that you, I mean, it's actually comic in times, that the police investigation, the defense team. I mean, talk about more characters, and you got to know an awful lot of people and bring them to the front. The trial, the insanity defense, to say guilty but insane, this effort to come up with a new definition of insanity. I mean, you had to do an enormous amount of delving into trial tactics and criminal justice and law. And what's your takeaway, if you could reduce it to, what's your sense of the justice system, how it worked in this case, and generally what do we do with people like this?
It's a huge question, isn't it?
Yeah, you've got a minute or two to answer.
I think he should have been in a place for the criminally insane. I'm not sure he should have been where he was. And I think that we had all of Goldman, his defense attorney's notes. And there's also one of the defense attorneys is still alive. And we had lots of interviews with him. So, Jen, you want to talk a little bit about the criminal justice system and how, and specifically address what Helen asked?
Well, I mean, it's really two justice systems, the one in 1970 and the one in 2021. I think they're very different systems. I think they're both still flawed. But the one that Tony faced, I mean, as Liza said, he should not have been in Walpole State Prison. He should not have been in a hardcore prison. He was clearly psychopathic. He was clearly, a malignant narcissist.
And they didn't know what they were looking at. They really didn't.
Yeah.
And we talked to, psychologists and forensic specialists today, and they said, you're dealing with the kind of killer that is one in, 1,000 of the serial killers. And so years ago, as Liza has said in other interviews, and 50 years ago, there wasn't even a term for serial killer.
Right.
So the system failed him in that way. And who knows if he committed suicide or if he was murdered in prison. I will always think he was murdered. And that's not that he deserves anything but a sad ending, but still, 3 years in prison and then he's dead. Who knows what would have happened if he'd had a better choice of lockup than Walpole.
And I don't think he would have been allowed to give his life rights to his lawyer as payment.
Right.
And that's a huge issue for this case.
Mhm.
And so aside from who Tony was and what he did, that is a huge issue. And it was done very quickly. Tony was arraigned on the, I think, 5th or 6th of March. And by the 22nd, both he and Avis, everything signed away. And that in and of itself, they just wouldn't allow it today. So again, it's an important reason why when you read this book, you have to contextualize it. Jen likes to refer to them as the Keystone Cops. And I think that's true. But I also think, Provincetown was like the Keystone Cops. Every moment of it, every store, everything was like the Keystone Cops. It was just a kind of a mishmash of people looking to be themselves somewhere. And I think I think that's why it attracted my mother, quite frankly. And so, so many things that happened to him would never happen again. Would never happen now.
Right.
And the reason that the lawyer had Tony sign his and his wife's life rights away was so that he could get paid by selling the book.
Right.
And they failed in doing that. But there were moments that Liza and I are going through, the papers and the notes, thinking, now, why did they go in that direction of looking for more bodies, for instance, more potential victims of Tony's? And it was like, oh my God, they're looking for more victims to sell a better book. And it just, as Liza said, it wouldn't have happened today. I mean, hopefully the judicial oversight is such that a defendant would be able to say, maybe to the judge, I got a problem here. They're kind of ginning up my case. I've only killed 5. Now, come on. Don't blame me.
He did try and say that, but no one listened at that point. He was,
right. No one listened.
Well, it's sort of interesting to think about, how at a time when you're, pre-adolescent, and it's all about timing. I mean, Tony preyed on what? His wife was 13 when he married her and when she became a mother, right? It was within, and
should we continue?
You were riding around in his truck, and he took you to the sites that he actually had buried and dismembered these women. So it's very, very creepy to think about how closely, and you said, I think in the book, that you think that he was grooming you in some way, anticipating that in another year or two,
maybe.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that it makes the book lends itself to the tension in the book, is that I had no idea what was going on, but the reader has every idea what's going on. And none of my siblings, none of my, there was a lot of other things going on besides just riding in Tony's truck. And no one suspected. I mean, we were too little to suspect things like that. We were too small.
But even the adults around you didn't suspect because they were still sending you off in the truck.
I don't even think I don't know whether they knew whether we were there or not most of the time. So, they were really doing their own thing. And again, you have to put it in context, but that was what was going on.
And that's one of the reasons I think that Tony got away with it for as long as he did. Because of the Wild West of the East element, the kind of outlaw element of P-Town at the time. And Tony was just another kind of weird stoner walking around and, always had a pretty girlfriend but he was a father of 3. And so the community was kind of giving him well, yeah, that's Tony. That's just Tony. He's a little weird, but everyone was weird.
Right.
And, a lot of them were high and a lot of them were drunk and a lot of them were, AWOL. And so it's just, it was like the perfect time to be a serial killer, if you will, because he just disappeared into the fabric of Crazy Town.
Yeah. What's next for you guys? I mean, I can already, I feel like I should be able to just go to my Netflix and find this in my, it's so perfectly scripted. It's so perfectly paced. It's perfectly done. Do you have any plans or any hopes or nibbles for this to be produced for a television series or for a movie or?
Oh, more than nibbles.
Nibbles, good, yes, giant.
Actually, we do have a film agent.
All right.
And, he is, as we speak, he's sending out the proposals and adding these wonderful new Zooms and interviews to sell the pitch. So yeah, we're very hopeful. And Helen, you're not alone in saying that this story and this book lend itself to a film adaptation, whether it's a one-up or a serial or whatever. But yeah, absolutely. And a podcast. I mean, we have all those tapes of Tony. We have, a lot of the people who are still alive and could be interviewed. So yeah, we are moving forward energetically and hopefully.
Well, good, because I think it would be a piece of cake. Really, nobody has to write anymore. They just have to throw some actors up there, and you've done it. It's really an impressive compiling. And one thing I wanted to ask is, how did you decide what goes in and what to keep out? Thousands and thousands and thousands of pages, and you come up with this gem of a book. Wow. What's the secret? How do you do it?
I have to give Jennifer all of that credit because one day she went away and said, I envisioned her going like this and throwing shit out. Because we had the kitchen sink in there to begin with, as often happens when we're writing. And I had the kitchen sink in there. I had written a first draft with like 12 books in it, right? So in the end, it got trimmed back in such an expert way. And that was Jen. That was Jen who said, this is gonna go, this is gonna go. I think this should go. And then we argued about what should maybe come back, And so it was a real process of elimination because there's all kinds of good stuff that can go in a series that's on the cutting room floor. So.
Yeah, and I think my process is determined and was determined by my journalistic background.
Yeah.
And so just the facts, ma'am, and the who, what, why, when, and where. And I just, even editing a radio story, you've just got a certain amount of time and you need just the salient facts and just the interesting facts. And so a book for me is like, wow, I've got all this room, but I still have the same rules. And the same rules are is it interesting? Is it true? Is it, and if it's not those things, if it's not part of the narrative, if it doesn't continue the flow of the story into the next chapter, it goes.
Yeah.
And Liza was very, very generous in letting me cut some of her gems that she wanted in. That I was like, yes, but next
Writers get attached
the next book.
in the next book. Yeah.
What is the next book? Or are you thinking that far ahead at this point?
For me, I have two that I was working on before Jen and I decided to collaborate. So I hope to go back to those at some point in time, but right now we're too busy with all things babysitter. At least I am, to do much writing. It's not a very peaceful time.
Yeah.
But they're there, and I'm taking notes.
And we've had a year between submitting the manuscript and then the editing process, and then the marketing process, and then the publishing process. So in that time, I started working on researching what will hopefully be my 6th book. But again, once this started heating, and COVID hasn't helped.
Yeah.
A lot of my research depends on travel and getting into others' archives that are all shut down. So it was actually a good time to sit back and go, all right, I don't have to always be the Yankee with something on my, front burner. So I'm getting back to it. In fact, I was looking at my calendar the other day saying, okay, let's look at the interview schedule and let's look at the marketing. And then now if I'm called to Hollywood to screenwrite the adaptation, then that'll be next.
That's great. So one of the questions that's, I know, pressing for many of us is who will play you, Liza?
Our agent, Jill Neeram, thinks that, did you see the Florida Project?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
so remember the little girl in the Florida
I
Project?
was thinking about that when I was reading your book.
Yeah,
Yes.
she thinks she would be perfect, but I think she's aging a little quickly.
Oh.
So, I don't know if we'll be able to pull her.
And we want Charlize Theron for Betty.
Yes. Oh,
Couldn't she do crazy in a really great way?
awesome. Yeah.
And we've got a whole list of actors for Tony, like Jared Leto. We love doing this. We
Yeah.
in our downtime we cast the film.
Well, that's something to look forward to, and maybe we'll come sooner than your next book. Although I think when people read this, really, I think the first thing that I felt was I need to read the next thing that's coming out. Where is the next
that's
thing?
good.
Yes, it is a good
From your
thing.
lips.
Yeah. We should probably give people a chance to ask questions.
Sure.
I don't know whether we want to bring Bree back on, our house mother, to help us.
Yeah, happy
Bree.
to help. Hi.
Hi.
I'm just, my heart is all aflutter. I can't wait. Netflix podcast series. I'm so into it.
Yeah.
So everyone, Q&A down at the bottom of Zoom. Go ahead and drop your questions there. All right. So our first question is from Richard. What motivated you to dive so carefully and thoroughly into all the facts of your life and the entire Tony Costa case as well, as opposed to going for the quick and sensational?
What allowed me to do that?
No, I think they're asking why did you make that choice?
Yes.
To delve as deeply as you did into your childhood.
Oh, it wasn't a choice. It wasn't a choice at all. As I was doing the research, it was coming at me, and the dreams were coming at me. So it was more of something that something I had to do rather than something I chose to do. Because if the truth be told, I don't know that I would have done it otherwise.
Laura says, you did such a great job of evoking the era of the book. How did you do that? Did you do a lot of research? Was it memories, journals? Did you listen to the music of the time?
Well, Liza lived it.
I lived
We both lived the time, but Liza lived the place. And so it was really, and she has an amazing memory.
I built a Spotify playlist because there's this great interview with Paul McCartney where someone said, you know, what happens when you're driving along and you hear the Beatles on the radio? And he said, well, first I sing along. And second, I'm dropped right back into the studio. And I'm laying down those tracks from 50 years ago. That's what happened to me. It was so much of it came from the music of that day because it was always on. And so I listened and I excavated and I worked with a therapist.
I was actually, this is a brief question. I was going to ask what your therapist thinks about the book and if writing it was therapeutic for you.
Yeah, therapeutic. Oh boy, I have a lot of trouble answering this question because I think it didn't end anything for me. But what it did do is it gave me an opportunity to open a different door and live my life in a different way. And you can't buy that. And I didn't anticipate that. So therapeutic, I don't know, it was like pulling out every one of my teeth in a way.
Cathartic.
Yeah, but in the end, I had choices to make and other roads to walk. And that's, you know, you can't buy that.
Mm-hmm. So Polly would like to know, does your moving agent know about all the bits on the cutting room floor? I think what the question is hinting at, do we get to see a long series with all of it included?
Hopefully, because there
Tell
is
her
a
not
lot
to worry.
Yeah, there's a lot that we had to leave out.
Yes, he knows.
And then Richard would like to know, could you talk more about finding the truth about the girls who were not killed by Costa?
Yes, it happened because in writing that section, was stopped every single time. My fingers would stop on the keyboard, literally, when it came time to write, and they were never seen alive again. Because I didn't know it to be true. And again, back to the journalistic roots. And so I had a lot more at my disposal than they did 50 years ago. I'll give them that. I had Google, I had Ancestry, I had Truthfinder, I had online phone books, yearbooks, and I just started cross-referencing. And one of the women had a really common name, Bonnie Williams. There are literally 500,000 Bonnie Williams in America. The other two had less common names. So I just created a spreadsheet of every possible person that they could now be, 50 years later, and started calling and writing. And I finally started to get
Yeah, we had a lot of stonewalling there too. A lot of people who just wouldn't answer. I think it was unnerving for people.
Yeah. So I found the sisters and daughters of all three women. They have since died, but not at the hands of Tony Costa. And they all were like, what? History has it written that my sister, my daughter, not my daughter, the mother would be too old. My sister, my mother was killed by a serial killer. And so, yeah, they were fascinated to learn that, the alternate history of their loved one. And they were also, in a strange way, really grateful that somebody was paying attention to that woman and that woman's life. And each of the women died sadly, but not at the hands of, as I said, not at the hands of Tony Costa.
And I do want to say too that Jen, we had an interview actually with a person who told us that she knew that some Tony Costa had killed this woman. And this is how she knew. And blah, 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 blah. And it went on for 4 hours. And so there were many times where we had that kind of information that proved to be wrong.
Right.
So, it took a long time.
Right.
It took a long time to get that out.
And again, so even though we had been told
Right.
that Tony had killed this woman, I was unable to write the sentence because it's hearsay is not fact. So it was one of the most gratifying moments for me in the process was to find them and to find their true stories.
Yeah.
And to not go on every single website you look on about Tony Costa, every single reference in history has these three women
That's
on his
victims.
docket of kills.
Every
All
book.
of them. So it's been gratifying to correct that history.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's amazing because I have heard the alternate incorrect history. So you guys have really changed the story here. Were there any parts of the book that you struggled to cut because they didn't necessarily belong in the book?
My brain's not allowing me to go back. Liza, how's yours?
That we had to cut because they didn't end up in the book.
Yeah,
Right.
They were there. Well, yeah, I was attached to my stories
Hmm.
and attached to my past. And so we really had to sort of weed through and say which ones run the narrative forward and which ones don't. Where do we lose the reader and where do we keep the reader?
Hmm.
So that's how, in the end, that was really the bottom line in the end. Do we keep the story moving forward or not? Because if we don't, it doesn't belong in there.
Hmm.
Right.
So similarly, Katerina would like to know, was there a particular event or moment that felt synchronistic or serendipitous during the creative process?
Oh my God, I love her. Who asked that question?
That was Katrina.
Katrina.
Oh, sorry, Katerina.
Katerina. Jen, do you want to answer that?
No, I don't, because one of Liza's favorite words is synchronicity. And every time she used it, I'd roll my eyes and say, there's no such thing as synchronicity.
Mhm.
And so to have Katerina, and I think I know Katerina, to use the word is just, so what was the question again? Tell me. I'm so stuck.
No, that's okay. Let me just pull it
No,
back
all
up.
of a sudden you're in synchronicity.
Was there a particular event or moment that felt full of synchronicity or serendipity during the creative process?
So in my answer to that is every single moment,
Wow.
every single date, every single song, every single everything for me was whoa, had a charge on it that I couldn't put down. I had written a blog post recently about January 25th. That was the day that the last two women were killed. It was my sister's 8th birthday. It was so, and the biggest one of those is reading early on in the process that Tony Costa's birthday is August 2nd, 1944, and my son was born on August 2nd, 1988. And so those are the kinds of things that Jen made fun of me about because it was like, it means nothing. I said, no, to me it means something.
Yeah. And
So yes, every moment.
yeah, I just keep coming back to early on in the process when we were writing the book proposal before we even sold the book. And we were working together up in Gloucester, at her family's house in Gloucester. And it was, I don't know, again, I'm hesitating using the word synchronicity, but we just got into a rhythm that we knew that the book was going to work. Because I can still see Liza sitting on, the sofa in the big room with all the papers, all the piles and piles and piles of papers from the archive around her. And I was at the writing desk and I'd be like, okay, I need this. Where's the fact on that, or where's the date on that? And we just realized that we had
Synchronicity, I think. Sorry, you paused.
a rhythm. We had a rhythm that was going to work.
Mhm.
And back to the early part of the interview, a collaboration that was in balance, and it felt so right. It felt so like it was going to not only work but be really good. And I hope we've accomplished that.
Absolutely. So what's the fact is you guys only sleep 2 hours a night? I mean, when did you have time to do all this?
Oh, three.
Three?
Some nights
Okay.
3.
Menopause. You don't sleep anyway, right? I recommend it.
Yeah, no, we're again, I think I'm a really fast writer. And again, maybe it's the journalism, maybe it's the deadline training. And, you know, Liza had done such, you know, humongous amounts of research already. So a lot of, you know, so much of writing a book is the research of the book. And Liza had spent 15 years already doing that. So we were 15 years ahead of the game. And so, yeah, it came together. It came together pretty quickly. Pretty quickly.
Well, it is unfortunately 8 o'clock. I know I could personally talk about this all night, but I hope everyone enjoys The Babysitter. Any last words you'd like to leave our audience with?
You should get it. You should get it at Booksmith because it reads better, actually. Little known fact, it actually books from the Booksmith, Brookline Booksmith, read much better than pretty much anywhere else.
That
I'm
is
glad
true.
you brought that up. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, support your local bookstore.
Yeah, no kidding.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stay
Thank
safe.
you. Thank
You
you.
too.
Good night.
Good night.